room. I am just going to hand over in a moment to the chair of the panel and they will introduce themselves. But I'm just going to say, because we've got half an hour on an amazing topic, we're not going to do live Q&A for this one or Q&A via the app. If you want to keep discussing the topic, all of us would love to discuss it at great length, but I wanted to give all the time to the panel for this. So, on you go.
Okay, thanks Charlie, thanks everyone staying for the session today. So, we've got 30 minutes, so it's going to be tough, but I did think to myself this morning, maybe this is part one, and we can have part two on each year's agenda, but we'll have to debate that, and then we can leave you with a cliffhanger at the end of the day. So, okay, so the topic is stopping short of the goal. Is open access really fulfilling the promise to the public? So open access has come a long way. We've spent years refining policies, debating licensing models, and expanding repositories. We've successfully removed paywalls, but have we made research accessible in a way that matters beyond academia, or have we stopped short of the goal? Too often we focus on the mechanics of OA, green, gold, diamonds, CC BY and C, rights retention, embargoes, etc., without necessarily asking a more fundamental question, that is the research actually reaching and resonating with the public? If the vast majority of people cannot find and understand or apply what's freely available, have we really succeeded in making knowledge open, or have we merely moved access barriers from financial walls to comprehension gaps? So, before we dive in, there are several interconnected themes within this. We've seen topics during the conference on citizen science. There have been broader discussions about open science, which perhaps touches on different areas. Today we're really trying to focus on who's responsible for ensuring that research is comprehensible and usable by the public. And if we limit OA to just free to read without making it clear to understand, are we fulfilling its real mission? And if not, what concrete steps can funders, institutions, libraries, researchers and publishers take to make this change? So, it's a big topic, but we've got a great panel that I think represents a really good different communities within the whole research community. So we have Dr. Marion Boland, who is the head of research policy at Research Ireland, and she'll bring the funder perspective on how public engagement fits into the research landscape. Dr. Emma Yhnell, who's an award-winning science communicator and researcher who's worked extensively on making complex science engaging for the public. And a familiar figure for lots of you, Andrew Barker, who's the library director at Lancaster University, who'll provide the insight into how institutions and libraries play a role in this ecosystem. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a question for you all then. So, one of the phrases that we've often used in relation to open access is that the public should have the right to access publicly funded research. So when we think about open access, do we see that as a promise fulfilled, an unfinished mission, or an opportunity missed, let's say? Marion, maybe we could come to you first because you're sat next to me from the funder's perspective. Interested to get your thoughts on that question.
Thanks. I presume that's on. Yes, it is. I just very quickly, Research Ireland is the new national funder for research and innovation in Ireland, and we're an amalgamation of Science Foundation Ireland and the Irish Research Council. So I'm hoping that the name Research Ireland isn't too unfamiliar to you, but just to give you a sense of the coming together of two funders to fund across all disciplines, so STEM and AHSS. So I guess back to Christian's question there, I actually was reminded by my very good informed colleague Edie Davis that making the research accessible to the public, of course, was one of the original commitments of the Budapest Declaration, where I guess the public were referred to as the curious minds. And so, we're, say, a funder that is 24 years on from that mission, if you like, and we must ask ourselves, well, what have we done to deliver on that? So as a funder, and like many funders, we do have a very strong focus on education and public engagement. So particularly in our large investments, we mandate that there's a very strong focus on education and public engagement and bringing the science to the community. So that is something that we, if you like, transfer on to the recipients of our funding. But I think we all know that scientists sometimes, and maybe the scientific community that are part of the arts and humanities and social sciences are better at this, but the STEM scientists probably aren't the best at communicating what it is exactly they're doing and how the community might benefit from it, or how to understand it or make it accessible. So we have put a huge focus, I suppose, on ensuring that not only is a very strong focus on education and public engagement in the grants that we fund, but also that our work is openly available. But that doesn't necessarily translate into the public, I know, are accessing those articles. So what we do, I suppose, is that we, as a funder, we take other routes to give assurance over the quality of that research. So we focus on areas like impact, research integrity, EDI, and all of those, if you like, come together to support the robustness and the soundness of the research record, such that when it does hit, I suppose, the public broadsheet, or it's communicated on various fora where the public access their news, that the way it is accessed, or the information that is accessed, is as robust as it can be, because obviously there can be several layers of interpretation that allow the public to perhaps receive a different kind of end result, if you like, or an end interpretation of it. So that's sort of the focus. I'll stop there and let Emma and others.
That's great, yeah, and I guess it's interesting to touch on that difference between, let's say, public trust in science and public understanding of science, and them having faith in what you're doing, versus even if they don't necessarily understand the science underneath that. So we should perhaps like to. So we'll come to the others. Perhaps, Andrew, we might jump to you next to talk about from the academic institution's perspective and your views on that question.
So I think it's always fascinating being at a venue that's really quite famous. So this is home to many conferences in the past. So being here has got me thinking, using the past and the present. So Harold Wilson described the Labour Party as I forgot the phrase, but it's a mission or nothing, and a moral mission or nothing. And I think this is where I've started thinking about open access, in that we talked about that right at the start, and then we got lost. A moral crusade already is nothing. We got lost talking about compliance, and we've been lost, I think, for quite a few years in that. I always set the scene with people by saying it's public funding, this is publicly funded research that the public can't access, and then all I talk about is compliance and journal negotiation. So we need to get much better again and remind ourselves why we're doing it. The moral crusade point came from somebody saying yesterday about social justice, and I definitely think there's aspects of that, and we need to get back into that and connect with our public. I'm very conscious in the UK, a relatively new Labour government who's made points through the Education Secretary about the university's role in civic engagement. There's so many opportunities for universities to move into these spaces and to demonstrate the value of why universities exist, especially now, which I think we'll touch on in some of the other questions about some of the challenges we face as a society. Libraries' roles, I feel, is a really simple one. What libraries have always done through history is connect. And it's our opportunity to connect the public with the research that's happening within the university. And I do think we've lost sight of that. We just need to get back on the front foot about what we're doing and for us, not just about compliance.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Andrew. Emma, I guess you have a different kind of relationship with open access in some ways as a practicing researcher, but you have that dual focus as being a really competent science communicator as well. So interested to get your thoughts on this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I've not been to this conference before, so learning lots and lots. And I am one of those STEM scientists that Marion mentioned there, but hopefully do a bit more work in kind of public engagement and outreach in relation to that. So my take on this comes from my background as a neuroscientist, working with people who have different neurological conditions. My PhD was in Huntington's disease, so for those of you who aren't familiar, Huntington's disease is a neurodegenerative disease, it's genetic as well. And I transitioned from working in the laboratory into the patient clinic, and something that I was really struck by quite early on doing that research was that there were lots of people who were being diagnosed with a condition that would absolutely impact their lives and their families' lives. And more than anything, they wanted to know, what research is going on, what does the future hold for me, are there any treatments on the horizon? And it wasn't through, their lack of trying, but they couldn't access that information. They were, coming into the clinic with these research studies and saying, can you help me understand this? I'm not sure about the complexity of this language. What does this word mean? So for me, that really prompted a career trying to make complex science more engaging for lots of different audiences and understandable as well. And more recently I've kind of moved towards education, and we have similar questions from our students actually. They go away, they find the academic research, the journal articles, and they say, Emma, please can you help me understand paragraph 3 of this paper? So for me there's a real skill and an importance of translating that quite complex academic information to different audiences, but importantly how we can reward and recognise that among our academic colleagues, because these are skills that we don't necessarily teach or train in academics, and I think often they're not really given the value that they deserve. I think more often than not people fall into that terrible trap of thinking, oh, it's just a lay summary, it's just a few hundred words, but actually that's such a complex and important skill that we don't necessarily train our academics in. So that's the angle I kind of come at this question from.
It's interesting, and I remember you saying something in the prep, there's one thing which is about whether we train researchers in it, but it's also this problem that as a researcher your performance is almost exclusively measured on the academic publications, and very little is given to those publications or work that you might do to communicate with different audiences, and I guess that's always going to be a barrier if that's not something which is part of the reward system, which I guess is what you're touching on there. But I think what we're talking about there is reasons why we should be focusing on this and the differences that we can make. The other way of thinking about the question is if we don't take the opportunity to do this, and what risks do we face as a community as a whole in terms of trust in research, in terms of managing public expectations, and in terms of, I guess, the general kind of devaluation necessarily of institutions and research. Perhaps Marion, if it comes to you first on that topic, I mean, obviously, one thing that you will face, I'm sure, is competition for funds around, I think there's a housing crisis, as we understand, and other places where that money should be spent. And so what is the risk if we don't engage the public from that perspective, from a funder's perspective, anyway?
So, I mean, the risk is that the public who are, I suppose, the voters and who are talking or interfacing with the politicians on the steps are going to be the ones who will shout out for us, if you like. And so our responsibility as a funder is to demonstrate the value of investing in the research that we fund, and to trust us, I suppose, in funding the best research so that they can feel the benefits. So, as a funder though, one of the ways that we've approached that is by using, I suppose, the impact agenda to sort of, if you like, consolidate what are the key offerings of a piece of research. And that comes back to the point, I suppose, about, obviously there are research areas that are extremely complex, and, to Emma's point, even a lay abstract can be completely inaccessible to somebody who does not have that language. So we have focused a lot on asking researchers when they apply to us, and also during the term of their funding, to talk about the impact. And what we mean by that is who will benefit, how they will benefit, when they will benefit. And if you can distill it down into those 3 areas, then that is, we believe, more accessible to the public in terms of they understand perhaps more clearly that a researcher working on, for example, a pathway to identify a new therapeutic target to treat a particular type of cancer, that it may not happen in the next 2 years, but the research that will be undertaken and the outputs will lead to the next stage, and the next individuals or researchers who will pick up that piece of research or output and continue with that. So that's, I suppose, the benefit, of using the impact agenda to engage the public in the sort of principles, if you like, of what it is the research is about, who will benefit, and when they will benefit.
Yeah, great. And I think perhaps to move the question on to Emma, and it's something actually that you'd said to me, Marion, during the prep sessions though, is about this kind of void to some extent in how we communicate this, where on the one end of the spectrum you've got a research article which is accessible to only really a specialist audience. On the other end of the spectrum you've got the kind of mass media that is likely to try and pick up stories and potentially interpret them in a way that's going to get clicks and sell papers, etc., etc.
Just interested, Emma, perhaps you could talk about from your perspective that kind of, you kind of operate in that space in between those, right? Where I'm just wondering about your kind of experiences of dealing with media and how that all fits together within this space. I wonder if you could touch on those points.
Yeah, sure. So I think that media engagement angle is really interesting. Certainly many of my colleagues are a bit scared of going into that space for some of the reasons you mentioned around, will the research I've been doing be kind of over-dramatised, what will the headlines be? But I think that does come back to those relationships and us as academics being really clear on, what is the story here, or if indeed is there a story here. And for me, lots of these issues come back to overcoming some of those scientific stereotypes, is what I'll call them. So, clinical trials take a long time to, have those results. For me, I think working in this space, I've always been concerned from a diversity lens and angle that, there might be some younger people who want to become scientists, but, they're not able to read the research. It's about inspiring those next generations as well. And coming from Wales, we have the Future Generations Act, which is almost looking at the way that we might do that. But I think it is a communication piece. Very generally, but there are some really key transferable skills there as well. For our academic colleagues, I think, the point you raised earlier there around, what is the purpose of a university is a question that lots of universities are asking themselves at the moment. And I think, we're probably veering away from a time where it was, academics to publish in academic journals, and that was kind of mission complete. I don't think that is enough, but how we recognise and reward that is a slightly different question, because I don't think we've necessarily kept up with how we measure the impact or the wider impact. And in some instances, that research might not have that impact as well, and I think it's important to recognise that too.
Right, yeah. And I mean, you kind of touched on Andrew's points earlier on. Andrew, really interested to get your perspectives on the risks to universities, I guess, if that wider audience isn't necessarily engaged, and how you can make that a priority.
I think we're seeing it already. I mean, I read a lot of, quite broadly in terms of newspapers and the press, and it feels in many ways like the universities have replaced the EU in some ways in terms of that drip of negativity. It's a decade old or so, but there's still a sense that, Michael Gove's point, people are sick of experts. The perception that universities are institutions which are brainwashing the next generation, that they are, that their purpose of them is unclear, that they're elitist. All of these points are quite live, and I can talk about misinformation, and I could kind of very easily point to certain countries where that's becoming a major issue. But then I can look at Facebook and see people I went to school with who are posting the same things. So I think the role that universities play and the role that libraries play within universities, information is what we do, so misinformation is what we have to try and combat. And using open access to do that, and to use the point Emma made there in terms of the research outputs in a way to kind of try and control that narrative, so it isn't exploiting a researcher's work to generate a headline that then turns into something major, but actually is an authentic reflection of what that research is. I think also we engaging better with our public through things like civic engagement, but also citizen science. It's small bits, but if we're facing a conflict, it's a conflict of a war of information.
Yeah, great. Marion, you had a point now.
Yeah, no, I was just going to remind me of a few things there, I suppose. We run something called challenge-based funding, and I'm sure many in the audience will be familiar with it, but that involves the public at the very inception of the grant as the end user, if you like, of what the challenge is. So that's one approach I think that can be very useful, but of course not everyone will have an opportunity to get engaged in research in that way. But it is, I suppose, an idea that I think is becoming more and more prevalent, if you like, in terms of focusing the direction of travel of the research in a way where it specifically addresses the need that is addressed by the public and the end user. And the public vehicles as well, of course. And the other thing, and again, I'd say others are very familiar with this, is the adoption of something called a narrative CV, which moves away, I suppose, when we receive applications, we are now asking our researchers to tell us about the diversity of their outputs, so not just the academic outputs, but also when it comes to the academic outputs, telling us why a particular paper is important, you know, in lay terms. So all of this, I suppose, you know, with a wider adoption is going to move, hopefully, the community more towards the sort of recognition of the broader outputs, and also how to speak to, you know, what is actually the output of a particular piece of research, and to take back control, if you like, of that content, to own that content. Because that's as much as you can do, I suppose. The journalists can make the sensational headlines, and we have no control over that. And maybe that's a very pessimistic view, but we can ensure the integrity, the robustness, and the messaging, the sound bites. And we just have to keep working on that. So that's just, sorry for adding to that.
Yeah, I think that's perfect, you know, and the result of inaction, you know, we can't change everyone's minds, but if we don't do anything, how can we complain if we haven't influenced those people? Not to say we're not doing anything, but I guess that's the kind of risk associated with inaction.
I mean, just a minor point, but one of the things, how do we explain that universities are not just for teaching 18-year-olds? That seems so often a misunderstanding of what we do and the impact that we have. Just an aside, but the amount of time you just read about the teaching and not the research, that has such an impact on people's lives.
Yeah, and I remember something you'd said, Andrew, during the prep session as well, which was about thinking specifically about the next generation, so people seeing the universities as something that they can be part of, rather than this kind of like isolated group that do this project out to the side, and that's nothing to do with me. And I think that's perhaps a really important goal for universities. I guess that's what you're coming back to, with the civic engagement.
Yeah, and working with schools, we've done a project just working with schools in what is traditionally called widening participation areas, and it's built on work we've done a lot, but we built on work that was done at Liverpool John Moores University, and I've seen the impact of bringing students from university from widening participation backgrounds into those schools. And it's, there's an invisible barrier to libraries and universities that people can't get through unless they're taken in help through before. And I've seen that work so well with schools, and we've seen a massive increase in numbers from those areas coming to Lancaster. So yeah, a real role for us there. Again, connecting, I think, is the word I would use.
Great, and I mean, I guess what we're touching on here is, we really should be doing this, not just that, but we must do this, there's a sort of really risk of inaction. The question always then comes, who's responsible for it? And I think we can all see the importance of it, but it's always convenient, it can be conveniently someone else's responsibility, let's say. Emma, I wonder if maybe we could come to you first. Maybe I could ask the question in this way. So, you are award-winning science communicator, but I think that's come through. You're kind of a self-starter in that space, isn't it? Isn't that was something that you took to and you've learned how to do? What would have happened if you didn't do that? In other words, like, how much would your research area have been communicated to these different groups if you hadn't yourself kind of self-started in that space?
Yeah, it's a great question, because for me, it was really powerful to sit in those clinics working with patients who were at risk of this neurodegenerative condition. For me, I felt really strongly that my research had to be accessible to them. There are other colleagues that might say, the work that I'm doing isn't important. I would argue against that. I think it is. But also looking at why people choose not to. Particularly, journalist engagement, media engagement, and I think some of that comes down to fear, and sometimes lacking in confidence, but also speaking as an academic, we have to do so many different things. So, as someone who is in that science communication, media engagement space, I'm aware that is a little bit odd in some instances, and I have very much chosen to do that. It's important to me. I can really see the impact there, and to have people write in and say, I listened to your radio series, and as a result my father was diagnosed with dementia, for example. For me, that's so powerful, and it's such a privilege to be able to to bring that information to different audiences. Now, that isn't necessarily a career trajectory that other people would like, and that's okay. I think there's space for lots of different versions of academics, but I do feel quite strongly that academics are being tasked with lots of different things at the moment. So I think we can't do it all, and I think maybe you have different areas of academic specialism there. And just to pick up on the diversity point as well around what we would call widening participation, we know that more diverse groups make better research. That's proven time and time again as well. So, you know, from that perspective, it is about what I would call breaking down the ivory tower. I know that, you know, an academic environment, a university environment can be really scary, and I say that as a first generation academic, someone who came to a university campus thinking, actually, is this a space for me? So thinking about how we engage, that patient and public involvement work that I've done, you know, which is the most appropriate environment? How can we empower people to actually say to clinicians and say to researchers, actually, I don't understand that, can you help me understand that? And I want to be really clear, that's not on the people, you know, the people in the clinic. I think that's on the researchers. But I do think we have a responsibility to call people up and say, because it's so easy, isn't it? We talk in academic language, we fall into the use of acronyms all the time, but I think we need to call those up and say, actually, help me understand that. Please, can you rephrase that differently as well? And, you know, that takes time, but I think we need to really be highlighting it and calling it up when it does happen, because it will happen, and I think we need to also accept that and be kinder to ourselves when we do fall into that trap.
And, you know, I think with all of this as well, I'm sure, you know, it's a responsibility of many different people, and lots of people can have a role in it. So it's not, you haven't done this or you haven't done this, but it's interesting to, well, it's important that we understand what could be the barriers to that happening more than it should do. But Marion, perhaps from the funder's perspective, when you think about public engagement, I don't know if this is the right way to ask the question, how do you sort of tick a box, how do you tick to say, we've achieved this, not tick a box? That really belittles the work, but I guess what does success look like from a published graduate when you're providing research grants, which I'm sure varies, but if you could give us a kind of brief, that would be great.
But no, it's a very good question. So historically, for our biggest investment, which are research centres, and these are grants which are 30 to 50 million over 6 years, a big focus is on education and public engagement. And I guess, you know, through a lot of iteration and a lot of discussion and, you know, thinking about how best to measure, you know, what progress looks like, what success looks like, we have developed a sort of a KPI that is associated with that. And we do bring in reviewers who are not just specialist reviewers in the subject matter, but they're also specialist reviewers in the whole education and public engagement piece. And that's not easy, you know, to get. Sometimes we have to get people who are specialists in the education and public engagement piece, but don't necessarily understand the science, but then that would be the key, I suppose, in terms of marking the success. So we do have a KPI target that we ask the research centres to set around education and public engagement, which basically is about ensuring that there's participation across all the centre and across different genders and different levels, because often it is left to a few individuals to deliver on that role. And I'm sure other funders and other researchers would acknowledge that it is often left to certain groups, particularly women, I would say historically, to take up the mantle of the education and public engagement. But the KPI target, I suppose, is designed around making sure that all genders are represented and there's representation across the centre, because if this is coming from the top down, you know, it won't be seen as a priority, it won't be seen as important. And because we set a target against a KPI, an EPE KPI, we are signalling this is important as the 5 other KPIs that we have set. So that's one thing a funder can do, I guess.
Okay, and it's interesting as well, I guess, thinking about the different types of grants, because I think I'm right, Emma, but correct me if I'm wrong, that Huntington's is considered a rare disease, and so not necessarily always at the top of people's agenda is the wrong way of saying it, but, you know, it's less than some other diseases that might be more common. But, you know, the impact of it for those families is and the people affected by it is terrible. So I guess it's about trying to, how do you make sure that you get that public engagement in the major big projects, let's say, but also for those areas where, you know, that they might not be as
they're not going to be picked up by the media in the same way, etc., etc. I think that's what I'm right in saying that was your area.
Yeah, and I think that point around it not being tokenistic, this is an incentive. Everybody has to be on board with this. This can't be an optional extra. I think for a long time, engagement has been seen as that. We complete the research and then we engage afterwards. That it can't be like that. It has to be embedded from the outset, from the very, very beginning. And I think, just to pick up on that point around diversity, and you see pockets of excellence, absolutely, in the engagement space, but we need to be really mindful about how we do that. So, particularly people with caring responsibilities, having events on evenings and weekends, that's a non-starter. How we reward and recognise things like academic promotion, and moving away from, publication metrics, for example, maybe looking at that wider impact as well. But it's difficult to demonstrate that. I think from that perspective, in terms of how we reward is really important, and recognise it as well, that breaking that academic mould slightly as well, which I quite like to do sometimes.
Yeah. And Andrew, maybe, I don't know, if you could talk from the institution's perspective, how well do you think it's understood whose responsibility it is at Lancaster, let's say, and is that something that's clear at the moment or could be clearer?
I think it definitely could be clearer. It could be, universities are not joined up and tend to operate in silos. So being more joined up, I think, is a key. I mean, Emma really has said exactly what I was going to say in terms of the challenge, reward and recognition. It's the same answer to the challenge around open access, reward and recognition. We've got a system that is in place that isn't as relevant in 2025 as it was in 1995, and that's deeply challenging. I know colleagues, we're all got, the financial challenges that are hitting us in the engagement sphere who are worried that they'll get hit first because it's not as vital as research and teaching. And on the surface, clearly, you can understand that nervousness, but then again, that letter from the Education Secretary focuses on the importance of civic engagement. So I think it's the reward and recognition and the clarity that needs to come to it, and we need to be more joined up, sums it up very quickly because I'm conscious.
I think reward and recognition, but it's also just acknowledging it's hard, right? It's not easy to do this, and we've got to try and make sure it's easy to do that, because we can't just expect that anyone can just get up and say, yeah, I can sort this public outreach. So that's an important point, I think. So
Absolutely.
I'm really conscious of time. I've had the wait, but so we had what we were going to get onto next was we were going to talk through just some sort of practical steps that we thought we could all start to think about now. What I'm wondering is that part 2 for the conference next year potentially? But perhaps what we could do is just finish with what would be really nice actually is I asked all of the panelists to think of if we were sat here in 5 years from now, and let's say we progressed much more in this space. If you give us a sense of something that would give you a kind of warm feeling of success in 5 years from now, I'd just be interested to get your different perspectives on that. Anyone want to start first?
I'm just going to say something really prosaic, and it really is prosaic. A better repository, more joined up with repositories to ensure that the visibility of outputs, the discoverability is much better, that we focus on pushing out the content. If we're talking about finding content rather than compliance, that will be a small measure of success.
Okay, great.
I think we mentioned it when we spoke before the session, but given the prevalence of AI, I think if there could be a focus on the responsible use of AI to communicate the benefits and potential impact. I mean, there's an incredible, I suppose, resource there that could be used and will be used and accessed by the public, I suppose, to understand what it is being funded, what is happening, and make things more accessible and make the ivory tower seem less like an ivory tower, and because they want, I suppose, to feel like there's a sense of insecurity, and we need to make them feel more secure, and that they are part of this journey, and they are part of owning the research and the content. And the other thing I think I've said to you before is that we, as communicators, I suppose, we need to ensure that we retain the essential meaning of what we are trying to do and trying to achieve, and what the achievements and impacts and outputs are. Because there's so many layers of translation that sit on top of that have the danger of giving that false narrative that we're trying to avoid. And we just have to take it back and own it, and ensure its integrity.
Yeah, I loved that phrase you said to me in the planning session actually, which was, we've got to take back our ownership of the truth. I thought that was just such a good phrase. But Emma, perhaps we could finish with your thoughts as well.
Yeah, so as a scientist, I would say, you know, in 5 years' time, if more people could see science as something that interests them, and you know, I think that's on us as researchers, as scientists. But you know, even if they don't think it's maybe a career for them or something that they'd like to do, at least there's that fundamental understanding of science as a discipline, so that it gets over some of the common misconceptions that, you know, science has all the answers, for example, and it's not evolving. So for me, there's a big inspiring the future generations who will, you know, come after us. If we get this right, I think there's a big diversity angle there as well. So we can just level up that playing field so that, you know, my worries around, you know, that younger person who hasn't even considered science as a career option, if we get this right through talking to people more generally, we could see, you know, hundreds and thousands of little scientists growing up.
Yeah, great. Okay, so, you know, maybe I'll just wrap up by saying, you know, I mean, I wish we could talk about this longer. I love the topic, and I really appreciate the panelists, all the thoughts that they've given to this. You know, like many others in this room, I've spent a long time over the last 20 years thinking about open access, and, you know, I don't know, maybe it's me, but it perhaps feels like the movement needs a slight sense of direction at the moment, and maybe this is a new North Star that we can use as a sense of direction. But there'll always be a debate on whether this is part of open access or not. We had it in our, we have a webinar, Karger in Conversation, where we talked about this recently, and people will feel differently on that. But regardless of how you feel about that, I think for us as a community where we spend most of our time thinking about how you compile and curate trusted information, you know, I think now more than ever is the time that we need to step up and make sure that we permeate that through the general public, and so that they can have the option to look at this trusted research. And I think, you know, that's something that is really worth investing our time in, and certainly in 5 years from now, feeling that we've made really good progress on that would give certainly me, and I'm sure many others in the room, a really warm, fuzzy feeling, and it's absolutely something that we can do something about. So I would really look forward to talking about the practical steps next year. But anyway, I just want to say a really big thank you to the panelists. They've been fantastic, actually, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you all very much. Some of you may know that in my day job I'm the co-founder of a science communication platform. So if there's any discussion, it pains me to have to cut short. It's this one, and I do hope we will continue on this topic at a future conference. But life is a series of hellos and goodbyes, and I'm afraid it's time for goodbye again. I will just make my closing remarks very brief. Thank you all for what has been